Hello there, Buzzkillers. It's the old professor here. I'm constantly confronted by wonderful new history books. I happen to think we live in a time where there are just more and more better history books than ever before, more serious, specific research on stuff that people haven't examined before, and on and on and on. And we have with us, very fortunately, Dr. Katlyn Carter to talk to us here today about her new book, Democracy in Darkness, Secrecy and Transparency in the Age of Revolutions. Professor Carter, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
As I was just saying, we seem to be living in this glorious period where there are more historians and there are more good history books and there are more serious researched history than ever before. And all sorts of new things are coming to light. And I didn't know at all, or never really thought about it, never paused to think about the question of secrecy and transparency in the age of the American and French revolutions and how important those issues were to the Constitutional Convention and also to the revolutionary meetings in Paris. It's absolutely amazing. And again, I read the book. I hate to sound like some sort of ingenue at a World of Wonders fair, but my eyes were just wide as I was reading the book because I was learning so much all the time.
Well, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. And I think that it is something that's really important and has been sort of understudied up to now. When we think about the founding of modern representative democracy, there's been a lot of writing about the rhetoric or the ideas of these revolutionaries. And I think recently there is a turn to look more at the practices of these revolutionaries and thinking about how they made these governments work day to day. And I found when I dug into that questions about when to open doors or what should be visible to the public versus what can legitimately be kept secret, those questions were really at the heart of a lot of the decisions that they had to make about how these new governments would look and operate day to day.
Well, I just wonder whether when you were starting this, when the project was sort of forming in your mind and the questions were raising in your mind, whether other historians or mentors were saying, oh, this is a 5-minute issue. This will, you can study this and it'll be a journal article or something. And clearly you show that it's worth a great big honkin' book.
Yeah, hopefully it is a honking book. Hopefully it's accessible though. Yeah, no, I never had anyone discourage me from writing a book about it. Though I think a lot of what I write about in the book, it's not that it was never mentioned before. Often in histories of the Constitutional Convention, for example, there will be a brief note about how the delegates met behind closed doors, for example. But it had never really received any sustained attention, even in a journal article, let alone in a book. And so I thought, this could give us a really fresh take, not only on how these revolutionaries and founders were thinking about representative government and how it should work, but also on the parallels and differences between the American and French revolutions, which is long time been a focus among historians, but
Hmm.
I think is only recently there are new avenues opening up to more productive or fruitful kind of comparisons of these two revolutions.
Well, your book opens up with a great vignette about George Washington and secrecy during the Constitutional Convention. And I want to tell the story because I'm so excited about it, but you'll do a much better job of it. So please illuminate the buzzkillers about these papers that were found in the street.
Sure. Yeah. So during the Constitutional Convention, apparently one of the delegates dropped a copy of his notes somewhere outside the State House in Philadelphia, and they were picked up and they were handed to George Washington, who was a recognizable figure at the time. And Washington came in the morning and apparently threw the papers down on the table and said that he was sorry to find that someone in the convention had been so careless as to drop their notes outside, leaving them,
Yeah.
open to the public gaze. And this is from a recollection written by a Georgia delegate, William Pierce, who writes that he started basically freaking out when he went into his pocket. He found his copy of the notes weren't there, and he thought they might be his. And it later turned out they were not his. He found his later in his room that night. But according to his recollection, no one ever claimed those papers. And Washington was so mad that he kind of left the room in a huff after that. So I use that anecdote to show how there was such a great concern with maintaining the secrecy surrounding these deliberations in 1787.
Yeah, because people didn't. I mean, people knew that something was going on. They knew a convention was going on. You don't have all the major political figure, almost all the major political figures in the country show up in Philadelphia, just to go to the horse races. This is something serious, and it was also amazing how George Washington really wigged out, and I apologize for saying that, in 18th century wigs and all that. I have to say buzzkills. I planned that one. Over this, he really was very, very angry and announced to the convention, who did this? Damn it! Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, I mean, he was taking that seriously. You're right. I mean, people knew something was going on, and there was some reporting over that summer in newspapers about the fact that there was a meeting happening, but there were very few leaks, really, in terms of the substance of what they were actually talking about. And Washington, among others, Madison, for example, they wanted it that way. That was very deliberate.
Okay, and then you also compare that with the French experience, which was very almost the mirror opposite. But let's start with the American arguments. Why was secrecy so important? I think a lot of buzzkillers will think, oh, well, the people in the different colonies really liked the Articles of Confederation because their local colonial capital was in charge, and very local, and they felt in charge. They don't want anyone to tinker with it and make the national government stronger. Is that the reason why the framers wanted the Constitutional Convention so secret, or were there more reasons?
Yeah, you could think of that as potentially one of the reasons. So there are a few. So yeah, one would be that these delegates go to Philadelphia and they don't have a very clear mandate. The Continental Congress has given them the authority to go and propose revisions to the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't necessarily say that the Articles of Confederation were broadly popular, but you certainly had people in many of the states who wanted to retain an autonomy in their state. So some of the plans that Madison and other more nationalist-minded delegates had would probably not be that popular, and they knew that. So that's certainly one reason. I mean, another reason is that they probably had concerns about foreign spying, didn't really want the word to get out about the government they were constructing. It's also not that uncommon at this point in the 18th century for deliberative bodies to meet behind closed doors. And the book kind of talks about how certain states had been moving against that model and opening more doors of the legislature to the public. The House of Commons in England had recently kind of been forced to open its doors to reporters, resisting that. So things are changing and there is an awareness of that, but it's still not entirely out of the realm of what's normal. But I think, and I argue in the book, the biggest reason that they decide to meet in secret is because of a conception of how deliberations on the people's behalf are best carried out. And there's really this sense that in order to reach the best decisions and construct the wisest policy, in this case government, that it's better to be insulated from popular pressure. So James Madison, he writes to Thomas Jefferson, who's actually in Paris at the time the convention's meeting.
Yeah,
And
everyone
he says,
forgets that Jefferson wasn't there.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Jefferson was not there. And so Madison writes to him and he says, I'm sorry, I can't tell you anything about what's happening, but it's what's best in order to prevent confusion, out of doors, but also to prevent against bias in the deliberations, which is really interesting. And that's kind of a way of thinking about how delegates can make better decisions if they are insulated. They can be in the room, they can vote their conscience, so to speak, they can make compromises, change their minds over the course of the deliberations without worrying about how that appears publicly or how their constituents might react to that. So I think that is a really key component of why they decide to meet in secret.
Yeah, I can imagine a delegate from a small state or a small colony like Georgia saying, well, I think this, but then be swayed by the arguments of, say, Madison, but not necessarily want his constituents back in Georgia to know he's being swayed until after it's over.
Absolutely. Yeah. It gives that leeway to change your mind or to cut compromises, right? And a good example of that would be on the issue of slavery, for example, where it's still hard for us to definitively determine, how the framers intended to treat slavery in the document, because the sources we have are very scarce because of the secrecy rule. And that allowed them to go back to their states and they could present very different versions, of what happened or of what concessions they got for their side of that question. And the ambiguity surrounding that meeting and the compromises that happened there allowed for that kind of flexibility.
Okay, but that on the other hand, though, that could be seen as anti-democratic, anti-representative even, and it'd be completely secret all the time. Was there, I know the answer to this because I read the book, but was there a discussion at the very beginning of the Constitutional Convention? Okay, we're going to keep this secret until we're finished, or well, and then you can talk about it afterwards. Or was there an idea that no, once we're far enough along, we can start gradually letting people know things, ideas that we're coming up with? I mean, was it absolutist? We're not going to finish this until we're not going to let anyone know until we're done.
Yeah, I think the idea was that once we're done, then we can present a finished product. And through the ratification debates, everyone can take a look at it, people can talk about it and
Yeah.
make a decision on it. But it will be that finished product, and that they should judge what happened in the convention based on that finished product rather than based on the deliberations that led up to that product. So there is this attempt to kind of separate those things. And Madison, later in his life even wrote that, he thought without that secrecy rule, they never could have written a constitution.
Right.
And he felt that publication of any of the notes from the convention should have been delayed as long as possible, ideally till everyone who had been a member of it had passed away, in order to prevent people trying to go back to the deliberations themselves and try to make use of them. He said improper use of them, but essentially look at them to try to divine meaning and to try to ascribe a certain intent in the Constitution.
Okay, well, let's get down to nitty gritty. What were the most worrying thing that required secrecy? Obviously, slavery was one of them, but I think the buzzkillers would love to know the details of why to talk about that needed to be a secret.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, slavery is a really key example of something that would have benefited from the use of secrecy in terms of being able to hold all the states together, just because, you obviously had regional differences in terms of what delegates thought should be done regarding the institution. And so covering those kind of disagreements, and this continued through the early republic, which I talk about a bit in the book, kind of pushing those disagreements off the table, so to speak, and
Yeah.
just kind of keeping them under a veil of secrecy, as Madison sometimes referred to it, was a useful way of just tamping down potential conflict on that issue. So it's a stopgap measure, I would say, to kind of maintain unity among the states, though, we could look at it from the other perspective as something that was used to, or not maybe even deliberately used to, but had the effect of perpetuating slavery as an institution long into the 19th century.
Yeah, well, I just wonder whether a lot of the delegates, particularly from the slave states, or maybe some from the non-slave states, might have thought, well, we're all reasonable people here, but the people at home they're liable to become overly emotional about an issue, overly reactive, blah 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 blah. We can't tell them until it's more or less decided upon because it's too, frankly, dangerous.
Sure, yeah, I think that is something to have in mind with regard to all kinds of issues in addition to slavery. That, we think that we are the wisest, we're the most enlightened. We have this opportunity to come and talk with one another. There's also this idea in the 18th century of, if you're a property owner and you're an elite white male, that part of your inherent virtue, that makes you more qualified, enlightened to be a representative and
Right.
decipher the common interest. And a lot of them adhere to that view. And so, yeah, there's absolutely that view. I think there's also the view that's related to that, which is that if we let all these people back home know every detail of what's going on, that we won't be able to deliberate freely and actually reach the best interest of people, that the people themselves, they don't always know what's in their best interest, right?
Yeah.
And so that we need to decipher that here in calm conditions, removed from the tumult of politics out of doors, as they would put it.
Okay, the other big issue, or another big issue that I think would have been so important, is what I talk to my students about: the large state, small state divide or difference in opinion about how a national government should treat those two types of states, or the difference between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan and other plans and things like that. But that seems to be so political science-y to talk about it with students that I could just see their eyes glaze over. But in fact, because slavery and other major things are sort of bound in with the large state, small state issue, that would have been the other one. I can imagine the Rhode Island delegation. Rhode Island, I think, is the last state to ratify the Constitution. Rhode Island people would be terrified about Madison's plan.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, Rhode Island doesn't actually send a delegation to Philadelphia in the summer of
Oh,
87.
oh,
So
I
they're
forgot
so
about that. Yeah,
terrified, they don't
okay.
even come. Yeah, they don't even come. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's another huge example where there would be concerns about how people back in the small, I mean, there were concerns among delegates from small states within the convention about Madison's plan and kind of a stronger federal government. So absolutely. And that is something that is very shocking when the Constitution is released to the public. Members of the Continental Congress, of course, they receive the document, and many of them are very caught off guard, thinking,
Yeah.
wait, what is this? This is much more than a revision of the Articles. And a lot of anti-federalists who write against the Constitution also kind of emphasize that point, that this is not what these delegates were authorized to do. This goes far beyond and creates a much more powerful federal government than they wanted.
And I often wonder whether the Virginia delegates are actually writing to Jefferson in Paris saying, breaking the secrecy rule in private communication. This is what we're talking about. I can just imagine Thomas Jefferson, maybe even before the Constitution proposals come out, he's losing his mind in Paris. What the hell are they doing? Is there any evidence that he's being sort of fed information sub rosa, so to speak?
Not that I've seen. In fact, most of the delegates seem to have adhered pretty strictly to the secrecy rule. I mean,
Yeah.
James Madison is a very close friend with Thomas Jefferson, and he does write to him over that summer, but he repeatedly says, I'm sorry, I just can't tell you anything. And, the convention's about 3 months, 4 months long. So if you think about also the time it would take for letters to be crossing the Atlantic,
well, yeah,
it's hard to, think about Jefferson he couldn't really be up to the minute, as we might think of it, just given the challenges of communication at the time. But afterward, Madison becomes, really concerned with filling Jefferson in about all, everything that happened. And that's especially true once Jefferson's coming back and will be serving in the Washington administration.
So does Madison think he has to sort of massage things or spin doctor things in the way he explains it to Jefferson?
Slightly. I talk about this a little bit in the book, the
Yeah.
process that Madison goes through revising his notes after the convention. Mary Sarah Bilder has a great book on Madison's notes and the process he went through to revise them. It's called Madison's Hand. And she goes very in depth about how a lot of the revisions that Madison makes to his notes from the convention are made when he's trying to prepare them to give to Jefferson. And he's certainly revising them to make them more palatable in a post-ratification context, and also to kind of massage the way that things were presented in convention.
Well, then when the Constitution is presented as a proposal, when it comes out of the convention, some people are very upset. They're upset with what the proposals are. And that's it. In fact, that's why there needs to be the Federalist Papers in order for them to get them ratified in New York, things like that. They're upset with the Constitution and so. But how much outrage is there among the public? And by public, I mean generally the politically minded people in the various colonies, maybe not the average person, but how much outrage is there? Damn it, you kept this thing all secret and now you've already decided and we have to vote on this. We could have had input on this and should have had input on this as you were going along.
There's a lot of outrage about this. And it's actually a very prominent feature in anti-federalist writing to point out that the convention was conducted behind closed doors, and that people being asked to debate the Constitution still don't know anything about the process by which it was written. So anti-federalists come back to this again and again, and federalists often counter it and are quick to respond saying, well, what are you so worked up about? We're giving you the document now. We're letting you vote on it. We're letting you talk about it. And I think that misses the point that anti-federalists are making, which is that that's not enough. To be a document written in the name of the people the people have to have knowledge of and be able to be part of the deliberations that form that document. And it's linked to kind of anger about not being able to offer proposed amendments, for example, during ratification.
Right.
That the whole thing has been reduced to a simple yes or no. The fact that it was all written in secret becomes really central to anti-federalist critiques of the whole process by which the Constitution is coming to be.
Yes, we constantly need to know as Americans, be reminded as Americans that damn near half the country was opposed to this, or 40% of the country, or whatever it is,
Sure.
the anti-federalists, and that when people talk about the Constitution as this, either coming from God or the Federalist Papers as being sort of a biblical explanation, it's just literally not true. There was considerable dissent from leading people. I mean, I get frustrated when so many people hold up the Federalist Papers as a kind of Bible, not realizing that one of their great heroes, Thomas Jefferson, was an anti-federalist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about this with students all the time. We tend to think today about the Constitution as a sort of untouchable document, formed by these godlike figures with this great wisdom. And what happens when we actually go back and look at the convention itself and the ratification process and the debates afterward is that you realize that the Constitution was very much the product of political dealing. It was a product of its time. And something like the Federalist Papers, as you point out, were written as strategic political documents, to get a particular policy, in this case, constitution, passed, right? Ratified.
Right, right.
So, like all other kinds of politics, the Constitution kind of arises out of competing interests, strategizing, compromise, all of these kind of things. And once we start to look at it that way, I think that, I think we need to do that because I think it can help us think about the Constitution as something that is dynamic and that is a historical document coming out of a particular historical moment, not something, as you say, that is outside the realm of normal politics or human creation or behavior.
Yeah, I think of people I see sometimes now have the preamble of the Constitution literally tattooed on them
Sure.
and don't
Sure.
realize that, it was a lot more controversial than that. Well, let's look now at the almost complete opposite, which is revolutionary France and revolutionary Paris in particular.
Sure.
What's going on there?
Well, so a lot of these same questions and issues are arising in France, especially as the monarchy contends with the financial fallout of having supported the Americans in their war for independence.
Yeah, we always forget how tightly these two things are connected.
Yeah, very much so. And in the 1780s, there's this kind of growing critique of the French monarchy, especially for its secrecy. And there are a lot of calls for convening some type of representative institution in France. And there's a lot of debate about what that institution should be and what it should look like. And what eventually happens is that Louis XVI convenes the Estates General in 1789. And what that is a meeting with a long, long history in France, but that hadn't been convened in 175 years. And it's a meeting of the three estates, which are the nobility, the clergy, and the third estate, which is essentially everyone else, the vast majority of the French population. And the idea is that they go to Versailles, where the king is, and they convey the grievances of their estate to the king in order to enact reforms in the kingdom. So that's the idea. But then once they come there, the deputies of the third estate are very insistent that they should vote by head and not by estate, which would give the third estate more of a voice. And there's a lot of conflict over this, and there's a lot of insistence on the need to write a constitution for France and to have a permanent representative body for the French people. So a lot of these same questions are coming up about how they should work and what it would mean to be representatives of the French people and how they should go about that.
But you show very clearly that the ideas about how secret those meetings are and how transparent they could be or should be, very different from Philadelphia.
Very, very different from Philadelphia. In France, there is an immediate and very tangible dedication to having as much transparency as possible in these meetings.
Mm,
And there are many reasons for that. I mean, one is that It's a very different type of body in the sense that it was convened at the invitation of the king. They have a king who is still there and is not happy
Mm.
with what they're trying to do. So in that sense, meeting with open doors is a tactic, right, to define themselves against a monarchy that works in secret and has been criticized for that, and also to court public support for what they're doing and kind of guarantee their continued existence if people, more widely know what they're doing. And in fact, the king does try to keep the public out many times early on as a way of trying to stall the momentum of what's happening and kind of keep that assembly from becoming a representative body of the nation. And so they are really reacting against that, fighting very hard against that.
Then how much do they publicize? How much are they telling people about what's going on in the convention?
Quite a bit. So they're very guaranteed to having open doors through their meetings. And I mean, another huge difference that I think often, though it's known, kind of doesn't get emphasized enough is that, the convention that met in Philadelphia, that's 55 guys coming into a
Yeah, that's
small
right.
room
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
meeting. The Estates General is 1,200 elected deputies.
Yeah.
So, it's much bigger. They're meeting in a huge, initially, they're meeting in a huge, basically vast converted storage hall outside of the palace. Once they move to Paris, they're meeting in an old horse racing track. So, just the size and the magnitude of that is very different. And from the beginning, there are travel logs and memoirs that put the number of spectators or audience members in the room at anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 people. So the deputies at the beginning are often outnumbered actually by unelected members of the public. And that's a problematic term. That means a lot of different
Right.
things.
Right.
But unelected people in the room where they're deliberating. So yeah, they keep open doors. They establish a national printer. They let reporters in to be writing about what they're doing. And they let petitioners come to the floor of the convention and speak and present petitions. So they're very, very open. And it starts to change over time as they start to experience some of the just logistical difficulties of that.
Yeah.
But it's very different from the American context in that way.
Well, then, maybe it's so different that it's not worth comparing. I mean, you're right. Just the sheer size of the number of people involved, 55 versus 1,200 or whatever. How do you think the openness of the French example changes the way those deliberations are held, but also what they eventually come up with?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few different ways. One of the significant ways is that it's much harder for the French National Assembly, which is what's born out of the Estates General, to ever effectively claim to speak for the people with what they're doing. And that's just because the population has near immediate knowledge of what's happening in the convention, of laws that they're passing, of their reaction to certain information. And often segments of the population speak up and say, hey, I don't actually agree with that. That's not the decision that I think we should make.
Yeah.
So it creates a lot of potential for disagreement during the process of forming laws or constitutions that make it hard to present something in the name of the people when you have many people standing up and saying, I don't agree with that. And when we're speaking about the Constitution in the United States, because it didn't come out for the people to look at until it was a complete product written in the name of the people, it's harder for that kind of pushback to happen. It's easier for that kind of disembodied sense of unity that we were talking about to kind of be forged without that constant disagreement.
Okay, I was thinking this as I was reading along, especially as I got further and further into the French comparisons. Someone reading this might think, and I did wonder this myself, might think that leaving aside the differences in the nature of the two conventions and all that sort of stuff, leaving aside all those things, that perhaps one of the big reasons that ultimately the American Constitutional Convention succeeds, that is, the Constitution is ratified, the Constitution stays relevant and is with us even today. The reason why all that works is the secrecy. And one of the reasons why the French experiment fails, or at least becomes so complicated and counter-revolutionary and all those things that happen afterwards, is because it was, quote, too open. I can imagine a non-historian reader of your book thinking that. oh, we succeeded because George Washington was so adamant about this and stamped his feet and got angry about secrecy. And the French failed because they were just wide open like Woodstock.
Yeah, I think you could come to that conclusion. And I think that is one important reason for understanding the different courses these revolutions took. That's why I wrote the book about it.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the only reason. I also think when we have to think about what we mean by success and failure. So as
Okay.
you noted, one way of measuring that is to say that, well, the Constitution was ratified, it remains with us today, we still live under that government system. But another way of thinking about it is in terms of what it actually secured. So something I talk about in the book is that, the use of secrecy, the strategic use of secrecy in early government in the United States, so in the Constitutional Convention, but then going forward too in Washington's presidential administration, that use of secrecy, it helped change the meaning of democracy. It did
Right.
help make representative government something that was not always measured by the level of popular influence or participation over it. The way I talk about it in the book is that it helped establish a more insulated style of representation and a less reflective one. So it kind of demoted public opinion a little bit, right? It divorced
Right.
it a little bit from the government in a way that didn't happen in France. So you could say, that is successful in the sense of guaranteeing a certain level of stability that was not possible in France. But you could say, on the other hand, if you looked at it on other circumstances, you could say that, well, the French were more successful in experimenting with a more participatory form of democracy with a more reflective style of political representation. And, that the United States succeeded in shutting that down a little bit more effectively. So I think there are just different ways of thinking about success and failure.
I'm so glad you said it and said it in that way, because we like to stress on the show, and of course, academic historians say all the time, history is very complicated. You can't nail things down to one cause, or especially you can't nail things down to one individual person slash hero in any
Yeah.
example, in any historical example. So there are 1,000 things that could have happened to the American Constitution, the Constitutional Convention's decisions, and then the Constitution afterwards. And it could have gone other ways. And there are 1,000 things that could have happened in France, and it could have gone other ways. I'm not saying it's all completely contingent, but it's things like your book show how extremely complicated things were.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not really, things aren't wholly good or bad, and it's
Mm.
not easy to make those judgments. Absolutely.
Well, Buzzkillers, we can't recommend this book highly enough. We've only talked about a smattering of it, sort of the biggest issues of it, but it goes into such depth, and it really made me think. I would have thought, starting the book, that it made me think more about the American Constitutional Convention than I ever had before. But actually, it ended up making me think much more about the French Constitutional Conventions and the Revolutionary Conventions more. It was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to be using it in class now, and it's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. We encourage you, please, please, please go read it. It's one of a dozen essential books to read to understand why and how these things are complicated and how they were not ordained by God. So it just remains for me to say thank you so much, Dr. Carter, for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. And thank you for reading the book and talking with me today.
And Buzzkillers, again, go to ProfessorBuzzkill.com, do everything that you do there, get the book, and we will talk to all of you next week.